So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the Hebrews of old, from the time of the prophets of Israel, indicating the times of the end and also the restoration. We are truly during the time of YershiYAhu, the 61st chapter, time of restoration. War, we know, is prohibited per heaven. However, are the people going to be obedient? Comes a situation when the great prophets of old would come to the nation, and are they going to be obedient? Because Yahweh is not going to force his way, but are they going to be obedient? There are more unrests in Lebanon and Kuwait. Libya is at war. Syria is at war. And the more wars, the more materials later for rebuilding. The more the Chinese, they come over and they take over as they are predicted. So then, understanding this viewpoint, areas of the chapter 1:8 of YershiYAhu then gives us many other understandings of then the region of the land of Cush. So it's very important understanding what it means in prophecy, the root or the roots or the trade routes from the time. We understand from the time of YershiYAhu then, he had a specific understanding of this prophecy, and then we find areas of then the existing situation of the time regarding then the land of Cush and what it meant, and obviously we trace back the king of Solomon or Shlimon in Israel. He was very prominent, and many nations would come to him for wisdom. And then they would come and they would hear the words of Shlimon, because Yahweh would speak through him. Wisdom. So then we understand then the trade routes from Egypt, they had a very strong relationship back then, because gold and many other artifacts were then sent along with the grain to Shlimon because of the great works of Yahweh. Then when you begin to trace south, you begin to find in the land of Cush is then an area where you find also a bit of a desert, known as the Black Pharaohs. And those were obviously tied up with Egypt, but Egypt had also a relationship with Israel at the time. So much so, because then even Shlimon himself had then the daughter of Pharaoh as his wife. If you're reading Kings, you find it. And the reason why it was this relationship then in place was because of the technology of the time. Shlimon was then in charge of building the temple. The temple was a machine. That's why you find the temple with a specific size larger than the tabernacle on the desert. Why? Because he was building a machine. Under the temple there is an elevator system, and this elevator system was then operated with a couple of sand pumps. Rather than using oil, not available at the time, or water, not available at the time, they used a very specific kind of a crude system, but workable system, using pump, and then the moving part would then be activated by the release of sand from a cylinder. Then it would be functioning an elevator system. It would elevate in the Holy of Holies, and then the prophets, and then they enter this specific elevator and then came down, and that's why then the Babylonians, they never found the Ark of the Covenant. Then the Ark of the Covenant was transported. You can find these situation in Maccabeus, where then YershiYAhu with faithful priests did hide the Holy Ark of the Covenant exactly under the site where then the Messiah was nailed to the pole. So then when you read the renewed covenant stating then, and the rocks split, It split precisely on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. So then when he was slain, his holy dam came down and anointed the most holy. That's where you read in Daniel 9:24. The anointing of the most holy then was completed. So then these indicating us then the most important time of Shlimon was making then friendships with the nations around him. That's why then Jerusalem is the place of being complete. So then nations from around the world would come to Shlimon to hear his wisdom. And then when he had a relationship with the daughter of Pharaoh, then from Pharaoh he had many relationships down south along with the land of Cush. That's why when you read then the YershiYAhu 1:8, you find then the land of Cush and then the rivers beyond the land of Cush. So then the whole understanding of the prophecy gives you the indication of then later, because then YershiYAhu came later. Then he gives us an understanding of then wars breaking out around the area and then going against them. However, the English context is out of place. They did not know how to translate it, because the most important was understanding the relationship of the nations when they were having this particular relationship with Jerusalem. King Shlimon was very prominent, and then nations would flock to his country, establishing peace and trade. And the land of Cush, or then the land of long-limbed people, those were very loyal, believe it or not. That's why then when Yahweh states, woe to those nations that came against the people of the land of Cush. So he's giving you the understanding of a defense of the area, because they were related with Shlimon. But then these people came from far away, and they had orders, papyrus or orders, then to do war with these faithful people, and they were engaged in bringing whatsoever they had in exchange for the wisdom. That's why then you find the prophecy very interesting, very inviting, because protects the people of the land of Cush, because they were very loyal and Yahweh knew it. So the translation in fact is wrong when translated to English, because then does not have the proper context. But then you trace back from the time of Shlimon, from the time of the king. And then we know Israel barely worked the land during those years, because they had so much from everywhere. They did because they were ordered to work the land, but in a very tiny scale, only to make sure then the laws would be obeyed. But they had a lot. And the nations, they were very loyal. And then after Shlimon, then the other kings began to do evil works. And then came later this problem. These people from afar coming and making war against the land of Cush, but they were very faithful, and then came the woes. Woe to those people. And then comes the prophecy of the end. And they shout on that day, meaning then the city, the holy city being rebuilt. Precisely on the area then that the woe was indicated. So then the black pharaohs, they were up north. It's a region of desert. They had their own pyramids over there and their own sites, and then you can find these in the internet. You can do some research. But then they had the service area in the south. Obviously then when they used to do the trade route going up to Jerusalem, because this was the only purpose. because the absolutely harmony only is achieved when Yahweh is then on top. And they did achieve this goal. So then there was this desert-like area, Nubia, known as then the Black Pharaohs at the time, and they had a relationship with Egypt. Egypt had a relationship with Shlimon, or Israel, because of the technology of the time. Shlimon was building the machine. If you do a research, you find this machine was under the temple. That's why you find then the temple much larger than the tabernacle in a desert. So then you understand why then they had this relationship. So then other nations that were having friendship with these southern nations, they became very friendly with Jerusalem, and they would go up there to hear the words of Yahweh. Thus harmony was established. And then when the Black Pharaohs would go up to visit Jerusalem, then they had storehouses, obviously, because then they would bring whatsoever they had produced down south, because in south they had the fertile lands, and then they would store them up north. If they do a dig over there, they will find storehouses. It's absolutely evident, because then they would prepare themselves for the long trip north, and then they would visit Jerusalem. And they would bring then grain, and then ivory, and then many other types of items local of the region. And then the Black Pharaohs, those were then the very ultimate authorities of the region of the country. However, then later, when the relationship with Jerusalem then was broken, then the entire continent of Africa became out of harmony. And that's the only most precious treasure they ever had. It was then having this relationship with Jerusalem, because they knew Yahweh. And they knew what harmony was. And as a result of these then wars enticed with those papyrus orders to make wars against those people, then the entire continent became a war zone. But then it says, woe to those people that caused, because then in the future you shall then observe on that day, or you shall observe, that's future prophecy, because a city would be built. And then the restoration of the trade route going up north as it was in the past, not for the sake of then the trade themselves or the trades going up and down, but then the symbolic understanding from where harmony came from, while they do the secular trade elsewhere. But then the route is established, indicating then the time of the king, because Jerusalem at the time was symbolic of yet the kingdom to come, where the nations would be living in harmony. So that's why the whole concept of then teach them then the kingdom to come government. But they were experiencing then in part the kingdom to come government while they themselves were in harmony. So the whole situation, the whole prophecy is coming, and then the restoration, even what they were in the past. So Africa then is searching for the great new leaders, but truly what they are going to find is their history tracing back from the Black Pharaohs, from the time of Egypt. As then Israel is finding itself then from the time of the harmony, when Shlimon was then the king. The restoration, where then later they would find even time amongst the Gentiles and then rebuild the temple. It was the time of harmony in the earth. That's what it means, restoration. However, this is going to be then a set area where then we understand precisely that the layers of understanding from the time of the Messiah. There is then in 2009 an absolute separation from what they thought was divine and then secular rulership. During this period of time, people were going to do this. They're going to do trade secularly with China, but then the divine area of then who they were in the past is going to be re-exercised. Not only his people going to resume the second tabernacle services, but then the idea of then these harmony time is going to be very evident in their minds because they're going to put it to practice. Thus, the trade route is going to be established as it was before because brought harmony to the entire region. And this was then the primary precious prize of Africa of maintaining this relationship with Shlimon because Yahweh was bringing harmony. And it started when Shlimon had a relationship with the daughter of Pharaoh and then became the whole friendship, southern parts were then tied up with Jerusalem. And should be because it brought them harmony. So this is the greatest discovery ever since. But then there are more areas related with this because then we can understand precisely that the Messiah then when he came he did explain it. When we read then Daniel and he explains time and a half a time and another time and so on and so forth, those huge numbers, those were then the times from Daniel until the time of vengeance. However, the Messiah, he explained a whole lot more, but we don't have the records anymore because the translators, they only translated what was then convenient for them to manipulate the people. They had those Megillas in their hands. They did not translate them. They knew what they were, and they were destroyed. Because they only translated what was enough for them to manipulate the people. So then there is a whole lot more that we should then consider and should search, because then when you read the previous covenant you find the many prophets explaining each of those then the Messiah went through in many details. That's why that we have only 10% because the translators only translated what was enough to manipulate the people. Though they had the extra Megillas, they did not bother even to translate those in a way that then we would have the records because it would reveal the divine plan. So we have homework to do. Please stay tuned.